Stand still. We're all here, huh?
Yeah. I'd like to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm Julie Wilson. I'm on the faculty here and director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. We're here today to celebrate the 25th anniversary of a number of events, to recognize the 25th year of the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter, to celebrate 25 years of volunteer service on the part of Harvard University students, Cambridge residents, and fellow Lutherans from around the community. To thank the residents of Cambridge for all the work they've done to support the shelter through all of these years, and to discuss issues of homelessness and talk about what the future should hold for us. The Harvard Square Homeless Shelter opened in 1983 in the basement of University Lutheran Church right around the corner. There are a number of members of that original congregation here tonight, and I would venture to guess that not a single one of us ever anticipated the shelter would still be open 25 years later. There were evenings in those first few years when we would serve meals to 60 or 70 or 80 people, but only the first 2 dozen in line got to spend the night. The rest either went to the streets or were bussed out to the Newton Armory. In 1990, a Kennedy School student, Peter Hofferning, wrote his master's project for the homeless shelter and suggested that maybe some of the beds should be transitional beds, where the guests got to stay for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or longer, rather than having to stand in line first every night. We'd begun to learn that many of the homeless people had jobs, and standing in line to get a place to sleep interfered with that work. The shelter decided to adopt that, and that began a new project or a new series of projects on the part of students who began to provide services and more counseling and opportunities to develop skills, bringing in computers to help people learn software. And the program began to grow. At about the time of the 10th anniversary, a member of the congregation thought to look through the student logs, thinking that it would give us information on the homeless guests. It did, but it also provided a remarkable insight into the moral and political development of the volunteers and what they were learning as they were interacting with homeless people and shelter guests throughout the evening. There have been more and more improvements. We renovated the basement of the shelter. We can only thank the residents of Cambridge from the bottom of our hearts for having helped us out to pay for the mortgage. When we needed to upgrade the kitchen, you were there for us as well. And so tonight we want to take this opportunity to talk to some people who have been involved with the homeless shelter, who have been involved with homelessness, who are in positions to do something about homelessness. So I'm going to introduce our panel in the order in which they're going to be speaking. The first is James Shearer, who grew up in Yonkers and wrote for his high school newspaper. After his plans to study journalism were derailed, he entered a lifestyle that eventually led to him being homeless and on the streets. After a few bouts of prison, probation, and parole, James moved to Boston, and this is where he met the man with whom he founded the Spare Change newspaper. They have been publishing it ever since. He's been a vendor, a distribution manager, a managing editor, and he's now the president of the board of a Spare Change. So this is a meteoric career path in journalism, I think. James Young, who is will speak second, is a third-year divinity school student here at Harvard. He served as pastoral intern at St. Francis House, which is a nonprofit, non-sectarian day shelter in downtown Boston, and also at Lemuel Shattuck Hospital, where he's done a lot of work with people who are homeless, very poor, and vulnerable. He serves on the board of the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter Corporation, and where he's been a very active member. Third, Jarrett Barrios, who is currently CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, but previously served in Cambridge as our representative to the state Senate. While he was a student at Harvard College, Jarrett was a director of the shelter. And we're hoping he will tell us a little bit about how those experiences influenced his later career. Much of his life has focused on health and wellness and addressing issues of individual empowerment, working against violence, working for education, for consumer protection, and against homelessness. Fourth is Alice Wolfe, who we all know well. She's the Massachusetts State Representative from the 25th Middlesex District in Cambridge. She's been mayor, she's been vice mayor, she's been a member of the city council, and she's been on the school board. She's done it all in Cambridge. Her priorities include education, equal rights for gays and lesbians, affordable housing, healthcare, immigrants' rights, and gender equality. From the point of view of the shelter and everyone who's been involved with it, Alice has been there from the very beginning and has been a strong supporter of the shelter. This is our evidence that she does a terrific job of supporting her constituents. She is also a graduate of the Kennedy School, of which we are proud. Phil Mangano has spent more than 25 years focusing on issues of homelessness, working on both policy, analysis, solutions. He now serves as the executive director of the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. Prior to his current position, he was founding executive director of a regional advocacy alliance, which became the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance, probably known to many of you as MAHASA. He started working on homeless issues working in a bread line in the 1980s, then working with African American churches in their response to homelessness, eventually serving as the director of homeless services for the city of Cambridge. Those of you who have been involved in issues of homelessness know that there is a very important article that was in the New Yorker in May called $1 Million Murray. It has a sort of an iconic life of its own in the underground for people involved in this. And there is a quote in that, and if you've read it, you will recognize that they discuss Phil with Phil's challenge to all of us to say, let's move beyond taking care of people who are homeless, let's get out there and just solve the problem. So, James.
Good evening. It's good to be here. Wow, that's loud. I want to talk to you a little bit about myself. And as was said earlier, I was homeless on and off for like, 15, 16 years. And it was tough. Being homeless is something you can't describe. I hope you never have to experience it, but I experienced it and it was really tough. I was frustrated with the system because it didn't seem to work, at least not the way I wanted it to work. I decided I wanted to do something about it. It's funny that we're celebrating Unilou's anniversary because Spirit Change, Unilou was indirectly the birthplace of Spirit Change. Most of the founding members, including myself, was living there at the time. And Spirit Change came about basically because we wanted to do a couple of things. First of all, we wanted to make money, obviously. The second thing was we wanted to educate people about homelessness. I always say that whenever the media portrays homelessness, you always see a guy on a park bench, and that's all you see. Homeless people work. Homeless people are people, and we wanted to get that across. We also figured that, we've got to start waiting on other people to do things for us and do it for ourselves. That's another reason why this came up. And we've done it. It's been tough. It's been a struggle. I've loved every minute of it. And it works. It really does work. Empowerment really works. As a prime example, 6 months after Spare Change came out, I got off the streets, haven't been back. And I'm just really glad to be here tonight. Thanks.
James.
Well, I want to say how happy I am to be here. It's certainly an honor to be here and to be able to speak with you all. During my service in pastoral care in Boston, both at St. Francis House and at Lemuel Shattuck Hospital, I had the opportunity to engage in conversations with and listen to the stories of hundreds of homeless people. Oftentimes, they told me disturbing tales and provided vivid images of the hardships of life on the streets and in the shelters. I heard countless stories of people struggling deeply with finding a place to sleep, going to bed hungry, drug dependency, physical ailments, worries regarding the welfare of their children, feelings of suicide, and the graphic violence of the streets. In my work, I've heard the resounding voice of an entire population crying out for help. More than anything, the homeless people that I've met expressed to me their simple desire to attain a house and a job so that they could establish, quote, a normal life for themselves. These tangibles are obviously essential, and the homeless require access to more affordable housing and the creation of more high-paying jobs. However, a large percentage of the people living on the street also suffer from problems with addiction and mental illness, and it is important that they have access to the proper health care, counseling, and rehabilitative services. In many ways, these are issues that have to do with policy, an area that some of the other panelists are far more qualified to speak to than I am myself. So instead, I would like to speak to some of the additional needs of the homeless that perhaps go beyond their basic necessities of housing, employment, and health care. From my observations and my working with and interacting with the homeless, many of them are also in desperate need of at least two things that are very basic to the human condition, namely, to be heard and understood, and to feel like there is someone who acknowledges and cares about their condition. These are, in fact, unlimited resources that we all can provide at the small expense of taking the time to listen or say a kind word. Too often, we overlook the enormous impact that very small acts of kindness can have on those with whom we either directly or indirectly interact. And this is certainly no less true for people who happen to be homeless. Every person needs to have their humanity and their worth as an individual within our society affirmed. This is a basic necessity that is too often denied to those who live in the streets or in the shelters. I've worked and ministered to a population in which much of America has given up hope. These men and women are good people who, under ideal circumstances, might be able to live normal and productive lives. Many are unwell, in desperate need of medical aid or mental health counseling. Many are eager to improve their situations, having retained a hope in themselves, and just need someone to give them a chance. Others, however, seem to have lost all faith in the possibility of their redemption. It has been my observation that oftentimes, in order for people to take seriously the offer for help or aid, they first need to be willing to believe in the possibility of their own deliverance, in their own worth as a human being. The process of climbing out of homelessness is not easy. In fact, it is too often a very long and arduous process. Moreover, the process can also be frustrating for those of us who offer help or provide services, especially if we begin to feel like our generosity or our resources are being squandered by a certain contingent of the homeless population who make poor decisions or experience a relapse in this condition. However, this characteristic is not unique to this population. Moreover, is this attitude that keeps many of us from offering our full assistance to the homeless on the grounds that it is not a wise investment to provide resources to a population who may squander our generosity. In light of this attitude, there are some who have given up and asked themselves why they should help the homeless at all. I would contend that we must help them because if we didn't, then no one else would either. I would contend that they deserve our help because we should always act out of a responsibility to care for our fellow human beings who are less fortunate than themselves. Finally, I would contend that it is our obligation to help them simply because it is the right thing to do. We've all had moments when someone showed us compassion, perhaps when we did not necessarily deserve it, and we all know the effect that such a display of kindness can provide in a moment of need. It's difficult to spend a day at a shelter in Boston without putting oneself in the shoes of a homeless guest and wondering how one could endure if under under the same such dire circumstances. Those of us in the church, as I am in the church, are often taught that the best is yet to come. We're taught that God has some purpose for our lives and something better in store for our future. This is a tough sell for someone who does not have a home, someone who feels like they have nothing, either physically or emotionally, left to lose. When will things get better? How much longer do I have to sleep in the street? How many more times do I have to be attacked in the subway? How much longer will I have to wear the same set of clothes? Does God really know what I'm going through? Questions like these demand our attention, and while we may not be able to answer them directly, they should at least provoke us into action by helping us to recognize the seriousness of the problem and the urgency that must be exercised in attending to it. In an address on the Vietnam War delivered at Riverside Church on April 4, 1967 in New York City, Dr. Martin Luther King told his audience that we are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This quote, which has been brought back into circulation by presidential candidate Barack Obama, speaks to the need for immediate and profound action in moments of crisis, in times when the severity and urgency of a situation demands a cohesive and comprehensive solution. This urgency must be made clear today if we as a city, and more broadly as a nation, are to take seriously the problem of homelessness and work together to create a coalition of individuals and organizations that can address the problem in any significant way. Again, in the words of Dr. King, there are many reasons why we can't wait. In December of 2006, I was able to attend the 17th annual Interfaith Memorial Service in honor of those who had died on the streets of Boston during the past year without homes. The service was held at the Church on the Hill in downtown Boston on the longest winter night of the year. During the service, the names of each of the deceased were read as a candle was lit in honor of each individual who had died. Symbolically, it was designed to remind us that the homeless who had died in the streets did not perish nameless, nor were they forgotten, as their flames still burned in the hearts of those who took the time to remember them. In the winter of last year, the Boston's mayor's office completed a census report on the state of homelessness in the city. On the night of the census, there were 7,198 people who were recorded as either living in shelters or on the cold streets of the city. This was a 12% increase from the year before, and perhaps a conservative estimate. How many of these people will, or perhaps already have, died in the streets of Boston? These 7,198 men, women, and children represent 7,198 reasons why we can't wait, and why the fierce urgency of this moment must force us to continue to remember this population that is too often forgotten. Thank you.
I'm going to just add my voice to the chorus. My name is Jarrett Barrios. I run a healthcare foundation and a policy think tank now. Before that, I was the state senator for most of Cambridge, and before that, the state representative for much of Cambridge. But long before that, in September of 1986, I was a freshman at Harvard, and I participated in something called the Freshman Urban Program, now known as the FUP, or the First Year Urban Program. And we were FUPpies, and in our FUP week, hey, there's a FUPpie in the audience. In our first week, this was my first week, I'd never been north of Washington, D.C. I'm from Florida originally, so it was a lot of firsts for me. But that first week, I was approached with a couple of the rest of us as we were walking back to what used to be called the Jordan Co-ops, where we spent the week living, which is now part of, I think, Cabot House. And we were approached by a woman who asked us if we had any money, because she didn't have any for herself or for her children. And this was the first moment in my life that I had been confronted, not just with poverty, but with the sort of poverty that would lead somebody to ask for money on the street. And taking her at her word, and I sort of put the arm on my two friends who were with me, we sort of emptied our pockets and our wallets to help her. And that was an interesting and a memorable occasion for me, and led me to begin volunteering after the PBH open house thing where you sign up for all the stuff, to volunteer one night a week at what we used to call the UniLu, the University Lutheran Homeless Shelter. I know it's now called the Harvard Square Shelter. I'm dating myself. Those nights of volunteering where we would wait to see what the crew, we would have volunteers that would go out to the local restaurants to get the extra soups and meals that were left. And with whatever came in, we would fill the gaps by going to Pinocchio's Pizza next door and getting some pizza, all to just have enough to feed, whether it was 30 or 60. We had a policy of not turning anybody away if you worked the dinner shift. It was my first experience as a fast food short order cook. It was the first of many. That actually served me well, because later I got a job at the Plow and Stars to help pay for college with my experience from the shelter as a short order cook. It paid off, let me tell you. But my next year, I sort of became more than a little interested in the issue, and I have to say it went back to that first conversation with a woman on Garden Street. And it was the idea that in some kind of inexplicable way, and it's often unconscious, we divorce ourselves from the humanity of folks who aren't like us, in particular who aren't like us in this way. They don't have homes, they're forced to panhandle on the street, they're somehow less than us, or not worth recognizing as human. And when you're in a shelter, and it's 3 in the morning, and you're the night supervisor, and somebody wakes up to ask for their medication, which we used to at least lock in the box because people aren't allowed to have their medication with them. And they can't go back to sleep, and they sit and talk to you for a half an hour, or in some cases for 4 hours. Their humanity is all around you. And it is the sort of experience, at least for me, it made me want to learn not just about them, but I became obsessive about learning everybody's names. And there was a time in Harvard Square where I could tell you the name and the background of every homeless person who came through, because they all went through UniLu at the time. And I still see, there's a gentleman named Bob Shea, who I still see on the streets. I don't know if any of you know George Despotes. Yes. George is around. I saw him on Cambridge Street just last week. And those names and those stories are part of that humanity. That humanity, the lesson of that, of believing in that, is that all of us, but for the grace of God, are perhaps at risk of having a shared experience. That we are in some ways on a spectrum. And that spectrum, some of us because of mental illness or disability or some other incident, drug addiction, may find ourselves in a shelter. And for others, because of better luck or better fortune or better life situation, won't. But that notion of a spectrum is, I think, one of the things that leads those of us who ask the question, why homelessness, why these folks, what we can do about it, that there's also another spectrum, and this sort of spectrum in the policy discussions that we have about, on the one end, when we talk about housing policy, spectrum from homelessness to home ownership, and all of us who want to be able to get to the point where we can own where we are. We're on the same spectrum. We're all human, whether we're on this end or this end. And as we take on the policy issues, and as Alice and I worked in the State House, this was something that constantly confronted us. There's some issues which are easier to advocate for. It's pretty easy to get money in the soft second program to help first-time home buyers. Because who doesn't want to help a first-time home buyer? It's a little more difficult. It's a little more difficult to try to advocate for funds for transitional housing for folks who are homeless. Because in some ways, those of us who maybe wouldn't quite admit it don't believe they're quite as worthy, that they're quite as human. The experience of working in a shelter, and I think one of the obligations that comes from that experience to share that experience, is the ability and the power and the obligation to bring others to the awareness that we are all on the same spectrum of humanity. and that as we advocate policy solutions, even the hard ones. One of the hardest issues I ever faced in the legislature was one of my communities, which was one of the cheapest places in Massachusetts, which by cheap I mean they were cheap. They didn't like to pay taxes. They closed their senior citizen center. They charged students $500 a one to participate in after-school sport, all because they don't want to do what's called the Prop 2.5 override. I call it affectionately Me-Town. That was my little nickname for this community. And in Me-Town...
You can tell he's no longer an elected official. You can say that.
So in Me-Town, there was a debate because it was right along Route 1, which for those of you who aren't from Boston, it's sort of like our Vegas Strip, if you can imagine. With the big cow, the big restaurant there, and there's no casinos yet, but I think they're coming. So along Route 1, there's also a lot of homeless hotels, or were at the time. And this particular community, rather than talking about how we can help the families, and the homeless hotels were largely for single moms with kids, their concern was the fact that those kids had to go to school with their children. Those kids had to go to school with their children. It is, even among children, this idea of segregating us and them, human and, well, I'm not quite sure what, is prevalent. And who are the people who are at least most endowed with the knowledge and the direct experience to counter those claims? It's folks who've spent some time, like those of you who volunteered at UniLu. And I would suggest that as regarding that, where you have the opportunity either through your church or through your social action group or through a political party or whatever avenue, that when we have the opportunity to speak up in places like the State House, you have a lot to say to people who set policy. I just want to say one last thing, and that is I am currently in my capacity as the CEO or the president of the Blue Cross Foundation. We do a lot of work. It's a health access foundation. And in particular, we've funded healthcare for the homeless and a lot of other organizations. And one of the things that you often don't talk about and don't realize, when you talk about homelessness, usually it's a question of, well, let's talk about housing and housing policy and how we can solve the problem of homelessness. But there's a host of other issues, as I'm sure Mr. Mangano can tell us, that are connected to the fact that somebody's homeless, but that have other life impacts. Healthcare and access to care is just one of them. Lack of coordinated care, disparities in health outcomes, all of this is perhaps predictable, but as egregious and sort of when you take the toll on humanity for how offensive it is that some people are homeless, this is part of the offense to all of us. That there are people who, because they are homeless or they are in and out of a stable housing situation, they're also in and out of stable care situations. In fact, sometimes their health situation got them homeless. And their homelessness now means they're less healthy or less able to access care or any system of coordinated care. If you're homeless, you're 3.5 times as likely to die as you are if you're not. I mean, these are the statistics that perhaps should frame debates. Housing statistics, when we talk about homelessness, are important. But the other issues, the other statistics that get to the quality of life or the lack of quality of life are also important. And so I would just urge us as we think about solutions that are in the policy arena, that we think about the breadth of the crime, if you will, that we are trying to address.
Alice.
Good evening. I am Alice Wolfe, as you've heard. I'm the state representative from Cambridge, although there are several. But you are sitting in my district right now. So I'm very pleased to be here. Before I talk a little bit specifically about the shelter at the Lutheran Church, I want to start with something that I will probably go back to in the end of my remarks, and that is that people, by and large, people are homeless because they do not have permanent or even semi-permanent housing. That is important to remember. Although there are many, as you've already heard, concomitant issues around people who are homeless, The situation that we find ourselves in now, of the great number, the vast number of homeless people who are seeking shelter, is not always been here. And some of that has to do with the fact that there is so little permanent housing for people of low income. So now I want to go to the shelter. I don't actually recall how I originally got involved with the shelter. It may have been through Mr. Reese, who was at the shelter, but I became involved or interested in it quite early. And I think in addition to the obvious thing, which is that you are assisting as students here, people who really need assistance and giving them support in a variety of ways, I have always been impressed by how important it is for the students to have this view, as Jarrett has described it, and to be able to work in the shelter, work with people, feel they are participating in the community, feel they learn about real-life conditions. And I think Jarrett is a good example, as he has described, of this. And I also know quite well Katja Fels-Smith, who was also the head of this shelter at one time, and who I met with after she just had graduated from Harvard. And we met at the Dunkin' Donuts in Porter Square. And she described to me her dream of opening a shelter for women who were on the street, not so much to sleep, but to be able to reach out to women who were on the street who couldn't even come into shelter. And that had resulted in the On the Rise program that Jarrett and I and others have supported over many years, and which still exists, although Katja has moved on, still exists on Broadway here in Cambridge, and works to assist women who really need it. And so you see that the enormous contribution that the experience of working in the shelter, and as I think most people probably in this room know, this is the only all-volunteer shelter in the country by students, and how valuable it has been for the students. And then we go to the value to the community. And for the community, who I understand have been invited here this evening, for the community to be able to contribute to both to the work, and also to the students. And as you know, as the representative who represents all of Harvard and all of Harvard's neighbors in Cambridge, the relationship between the university and the local community has its difficulties sometimes. And I think the ability for the community to be working with the students, to be supporting the students, to recognize, as I have really recognized for many years, that the students make huge contributions in our community, not only in the shelter, but specifically also with the schools and with young people. I think that is a great value that you are giving to the community and to the relationship between the community and the university. So I think that's another concomitant thing that the shelter does that people probably don't think about very often. We are now at the state level going to look at and have started to fund somewhat of a new approach to the homeless population. There's just been a commission that has come out with a report. There have been some pilot programs here, and basically, you can have different names for it, but it's Homes First. And the idea is that what we really want to do is to do what Phil Mangano has been talking about for 10 or 15 years, which is to recognize that people who are homeless, and particularly people who have been homeless over a period of time, are need more than they're getting in services, and are very expensive to our communities and to our public programs, and that we could do much better by actually assuring that we get people into homes, and it would probably pay for itself, as well as the compassion factor would pay for itself. So we have now, through the state budget, have funded some pilot programs in that regard, and it's being proposed for this year that some additional funding come in to try to really to make that happen. There are barriers and there are difficulties. Some of the barriers are that there are trying to find permanent housing that is affordable is tough, particularly in the urban areas around here. As you know, costs are very, very high. And the resource that we used to have 20, 25 years ago, namely single room occupancies, virtually doesn't exist anymore in communities in the greater Boston area. They mostly have shut down. In addition to which, of course, for many people who would be moving from shelters, there will need to be a supportive atmosphere. A second issue for us is the fact that for many shelters around the state, and there are many shelters that are state-funded or partially state-funded, for many shelters, there's a feeling that we have to get substance abusers off of their substances. We have to deal with all of the issues before we're going to put people in permanent housing. That isn't working. And so what we really need to do is convince these providers that we have to begin to change the way in which we are working with the clients, and to recognize the multiple issues that they may have at this point, and to therefore provide the roof over the head, provide the services. And there's some ample evidence that if we do that from a public point of view, from a public financing point of view, that with the funding that we are now allocating for the combination of shelters and medical care, which of course people who are in shelters get only from time to time, only in emergencies when they are very, very ill, and that is very, very expensive, instead of getting ongoing health care, and therefore feeling better, and therefore not having to go to, with all of those funds, if we put it all together for the same amount of money that we're spending now, we can actually take care of people in a much more humane and more long-term way. So that is where we're going, and that's why I started out with saying these are people who do not have housing. They don't have a roof over their head. And I want to just say one other thing that is in a way connected with this. At least from my experience, and I have to be careful because others, such as Phil, may have a historic perspective that belies this, but from my experience, and you've already heard I've been around a while, this issue of homelessness at the level that we are dealing with it now in our community and across the state did not exist before 1980. Now, there were some people, particularly substance abusers, who were hanging around Central Square, or hanging around in Harvard Square prior to that time. But the number of both families and individuals, that just did not exist. And the change came when we had a little political change of regime in 1980, and the housing, the budget for affordable housing over a period of a couple of years went from $32 billion a year down to $8 billion a year. And that is really when there was a surge of people out on the street. So that tells you something about the fact that we could perhaps go back and try to repair all of that, and begin to really see that in the long run, It is not acceptable for people to live in shelters, and it is not acceptable for people not to have the services that they have. And every year in my budget letters, and Phil may remember this from my early days in the legislature when he was the executive director of Mahasa, I would ask as one of my priorities for funding for shelters. And the first sentence was, I want to get to the point where I do not have to ask for this funding again because everyone has a roof over their heads. Thank you. Phil.
I'm very glad to be here. I've been living the last 6 years of my life down in exile in Washington, D.C., so I know I'm high up on your prayer lists. I do try, though, to live according to that ancient adage in our nation's capital. It's wisdom that's been passed down from generation to generation there. It goes like this: any day out of Washington, that's a good day. So I travel pretty aggressively, but I'm really happy to be here with you tonight, and I'm very happy to be flanked by the very folk I'm flanked with Julie. We worked on some projects for homeless families years ago in terms of research and data collection. And Jarrett, I plagued his office often and him often. Whenever we would see him, we would talk about homelessness. He was very amenable to the issue for obvious reasons that he stated today. And poor Alice had all of those different positions, and I was the director of homeless services, so I'd plague her at that level. And then she went to the State House, so I was leading a statewide advocacy group, so I plagued her at that level on the issue of homelessness. Again, one of the real champions in the State House. And James, I think I've known you just about since Spirit Change started. I might have bought the first newspaper off of you. And it's great to meet James, who has brings another dimension to the issue, so certainly appreciate that. And I'm glad to be here, of course, to commemorate the 25th anniversary of what I would call UniLou, and certainly the commitment of the Phillips Brooks House, the church, and of course the community and the Harvard students who really dedicated themselves through the commitment to that shelter to the well-being of our poorest neighbors. And that's, of course, who homeless people are. They're simply our poorest neighbors. And I think it's an effort for 25 years that this university, the students who have been involved, that church, and the entire community should be very proud of. I think it's an expression of what's best about this community in terms of initiating a response and then sustaining that response over time. And it wasn't always a pretty sight. People were concerned that that shelter was in Harvard Square, businesses and pedestrians, and so it wasn't the simplest thing to do, but it was the resolve of the church and the Phillips Brooks House to maintain it. I have to say, I first heard of UniLou when I was volunteering on Boston's first bread line since the Great Depression in the early 1980s. And we heard about a new resource for homeless people that had been created in Harvard Square. And since there was such a paucity of shelter beds, any new bed that came online, we were very aggressive because we saw so many people in the course of that bread line who had no place to live. They were literally living on the streets and in some of the garages and other desultory places. So we never were quite sure what this UniLou, where that came from, actually. All we knew is there was a shelter over in Cambridge. It was called UniLou. And I remember there was a gentleman who came to the bread line who was actually from England. And we made the arrangements for him to come over. And we said to him, we're going to send you over to UniLou. And he was mystified by that. I know some of you who have been to England will explain to the others why that was so mystifying to that man. We owe a big debt of gratitude, of course, for UniLou to Stuart Guernsey, who at that time was a student at Harvard Divinity School and just had a vision and had an impulse and an intent for those. And in those early years, of course, this was primarily a population that had been deinstitutionalized from the back wards of mental institutions here throughout Massachusetts and in many other states. You know, that's a national effort. In fact, that well-intended policy, we sometimes forget, absolutely well-intended, that legislation at the federal level was actually signed into being by President John F. Kennedy. It was meant to be a progressive piece of legislation that moved people out of the horrific conditions, the inhumane conditions in the back wards. We saw those documentaries by Frederick Wiseman and others called Titicut Follies and others. And we did. We moved hundreds of thousands of people out of the back wards. Unfortunately, we didn't deliver the community services that people need, placed them in YMCA and YWCA and rooming house and lodging house rooms without those services, with their meds. The meds had terrible side effects. People put off taking the meds. They decompensated in place and fell to the street. So the well-intended policy led to the unintended consequence of pervasive street homelessness all across our country. And Stewart had a vision for those people, and that was part of the rallying cry to really remedy the failure of deinstitutionalization around our country. When I became the director of homeless services for the city of Cambridge, I went around the city to talk to everyone. I wanted to organize our policy and our initiatives around the most inductive approach that was possible. So I went out and talked to the shelters and to business owners and to a number of people in the community, with clergy, with the Elderly Center, with the Salvation Army and Shelter Inc., and the churches. But the visit that most impressed me was with Reverend Fred Reese, who was then the pastor at University Lutheran Church. Fred was very proud of the partnership that he had with Phillips Brooks House. There's no question about that. But he also sounded a cautionary note about the commitment that was made in UniLou and the issue of homelessness in general moving forward. After all, even at that time, this was in 1986, it was shocking and surprising that UniLou still existed 3.5 years into its life, because it wasn't intended to be a long-term effort. It was meant to be, we roll up our sleeves and we vanquish this social disgrace, this moral and spiritual wrong on the streets of our communities. He wondered aloud how long it would take, how long it would need to go on. And of course, his concerns were well-founded. After 2 decades later, we have the same question. As Fred might have put it, how long, O Lord? How long? At another church in Cambridge, I can remember singing a hymn during a service there that was filled with homeless people that included the prophetic strain, "Save us, Lord, from weak resignation to the evil we abhor." Stewart and Fred and Phillips Brooks and the church and the students were hardly resigned to that evil. They were resolved to bring it to an end. Now, years later, when I was the executive director of Mahasa, and we were advocating for and winning additional winter overflow beds by going to Jarrett's office and going to Alice's office and going every place we needed to go, we won many new overflow beds, and as a result of that, the state and the contract that they gave to us, they thought, this little UniLou contract, we're going to throw that in as well. You manage that contract. And it was a unique and distinct and unprecedented occurrence, and it was a very unique contract in that they never asked for more money, which was, I can assure you, very unique among social service providers to this very day. In fact, a most aberrational behavior for social service providers. In fact, for a few years, they asked for less money, which certainly qualifies them, I think, for Ripley's Believe It or Not, don't you? I've never heard of that before. In all my years, 27 years, I'd never heard of it. When UniLou began, it was part of the best technology that we had to respond to the policy and personal failings that we saw in the streets. We had bread lines and soup kitchens and meal programs, all a quarter century ago. Thankfully, our approach has evolved with innovations that were created to respond to the past failings. Permanent supportive housing, assertive community treatment teams, no wrong door, cost studies, Project Homeless Connect. These innovations in our response to homelessness have taught us that the old responses needn't be our final response or approach. They taught us how to welcome our homeless neighbors and look them directly in the eye instead of averting our eyes. They taught us how to move beyond an outreach that enabled people to stay out rather than engaging them to come in. They taught us that the economic impact and consequences of homelessness were important in driving the political will to motivate that political will to move beyond simply managing the issue of homelessness to get on with solving that problem. And they taught us, too, through rapid rehousing, and Alice is quite right on this, rapid rehousing and housing first models, that the equation of homelessness can be changed. That housing is the nexus of stability and security around which all of our other services can be wrapped. That our homeless neighbors can sustain housing with the right supports. If innovations that are now field-tested and evidence-based and proven do not evolve our past responses, we do a grave disservice to those whom we serve. After all, when you leave here tonight, you won't search for further information by thumbing through the Encyclopedia Britannica, will you? 25 years ago, you may have. And when you leave here and you need to call somebody when you're walking on the street, you won't be fumbling for change in your pocket to put into the local payphone, as we would have done 25 years ago. And tonight, when we go catch up on the election results and what's happening, when we finally turn on our television, we won't be adjusting the antenna rabbit ears to get that perfect reception that we were looking for that we might have done 25 years ago. Encyclopedias and payphones and antennas were the best we had back then, but our technology has evolved. And the good news is that the technology in addressing homelessness has evolved too. All across the country, those who have been living on our streets and languishing in our shelters for years, sometimes for decades, are being rapidly rehoused. And those housing and support services work for 85% of our neighbors who might otherwise be thought to only require a blanket and a bowl of soup on our streets. The resources targeted to homeless people have increased and are more aggressively involved in housing intervention. In the federal budget alone, 7 consecutive years of increased record targeted resources to homeless people. And in the president's budget for 2009, the upcoming budget, another record level of resources. The first time that budget has included more than $5 billion targeted to homeless people. More resources in the state as well. Governor Patrick and Lieutenant Governor Murray are committed on this issue. They've increased the resources. Private philanthropy and foundations have increased the resources as well. The question for us, with more resources on the table than ever before targeted to homeless people, is what will we do with those resources? Will we simply expend and fund them on the past status quo that hasn't given us the result, nor given the result to the consumer that they've wanted, namely their homelessness being ended, or will we begin to use those resources to invest in the result of ending homelessness? Our nostalgia for the old approaches is understandable. I know them well. I felt good every night when I walked home from the bread line, and every night I walked home from the meal programs. In the meanwhile, our neighbors were still living on the street, still subject to the vagaries of homelessness, but I felt good when I was home in my bed, safe and secure. A misplaced nostalgia that should yield to the real meaning of the word, and of course that word nostalgia comes from the Greek nostos, which means returning or going home, and algos, pain. And what nostalgia really means is people feeling the pain of feeling like they can't get home any longer. So that nostalgia is what we've left homeless people with, and the efforts that we're making around the country is to remedy that. And part of that remedy is to apply the 3 R's of homelessness: research, resources, and results. And that's what we're beginning to see around our country in the investment of the resources. So I commemorate the 25th anniversary of Unilu Shelter and all of the good deeds and intentions of all who are involved, all of the resolve assembled there over so many years, the students assembled on the front lines. But I also commend Phillips Brooks House for now taking action to evolve that response in its current housing initiative. That evolution will allow Unilu to be what emergency shelters were originally intended to be: a short-term triage placement that led to stable, supported housing placements, and to allow Phillips Brooks House and the students to be part of a national movement to end a social disgrace. Finally, if I could have one more minute. Finally, the vision of what UniLu is has been given to us. And it was given to us by the person who won the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago, Muhammad Yunus. And I know many of you know the great work that Muhammad Yunus did in disturbing the status quo of how loans are made, especially how loans are made to the poorest people on earth. You know, he began making loans to the poorest, and people said, it's a waste of time. You'll never see repayment. It won't make any difference. Well, 3 million loans later, with a repayment rate of 97%, and lives changed not only in his home country of Bangladesh, but throughout the world where that effort has been replicated, he leaves us the vision of what UniLu can be. Because in his biography, what Muhammad Yunus said was, he said, my goal is that my grandchildren will have to go to a museum to see what poverty once was. That's the evolution of UniLu. So someday, when his grandchildren are touring around, they'll come here to Cambridge, and they'll visit the UniLu Shelter Museum to see what the horrible disgrace of homelessness once was in this community and in our nation. And Phillips Brooks will have a new public project for its students, because we're going to need a lot of curators and docents for that museum. So I commend the work that's being done here, and I want to assure you that we acknowledge that, and that if we do that, if we evolve UniLu to there, I can assure you that somewhere, wherever they are, the smiling countenances of Stuart Guernsey and Fred Reese will approve that final transition and whisper, too long, O Lord, too long.
We have time for a few questions. So people should line up at the mics. There are some rules about questions at the Kennedy School. First, tell us who you are and an affiliation if you have one. And second, questions are short and they end with a question mark.
And they ended the question mark.
Yeah. Right here to the right.
Oh. Hi, my name is Ellen Frith. I have my Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School. I remember when UniLu Shelter was built. And I remember at St. John the Evangelist on Bowdoin Street when the Beacon Chambers burned down, and we housed people in our parish hall, and that's how I got involved with working with homelessness, and I'm one of the founding mothers of Sojourner House, which is still up and going. And the challenge that I would like to offer is anybody sitting in this room could be homeless under certain circumstances. And I think that's why people fear homeless people or people that are on the street. And I would like you to offer some real good suggestions on how people can get involved with this. It's really very simple. I mean, I thought I would never be able to start a shelter, and I did. And I think that if people can just be interested and involved and put themselves in the place of somebody who has to walk the streets day and night. So could you offer some clear direction on how people that are gathered here tonight can get involved?
Yep, James.
Two things. Acknowledging that homeless people are there and getting other people to do it. One of the things that I see all the time is people walking past people that are panhandling, and they act like they're not even there. You know, it's like something Jarrett said, like people divorce themselves. And I think that's one thing is we can talk to people about this issue and get them to care about it. People have to start caring about homelessness again, because I think for a long time it's been ignored. The other thing that I think people can do is get outraged at whoever. You know, it could be the people at the State House. It could be anybody. Get outraged about this. It's shameful that in one of the richest, most powerful countries in the world, we have people sleeping on our streets, and that's very sad. You know, I talk to students that are not from this country all the time, and the one thing they say to me constantly, wow, where I come from, this doesn't really exist. It's so sad to see it out here. But that's two of the things is get people to care about homelessness again and get mad about it at somebody. You know, just say, you know what, this is enough of this. It's time we do something about it now.
I'd just like to thank Dr. Wilson for putting this on. It's a lot of attention to a local need that we don't often see in the forum. So I'm very grateful for that and for everyone who managed to make it here tonight. Everyone at the staff really appreciates your attendance and the fact that you care so much about the shelter and about this issue in the community. In terms of moving to my question, it's specifically geared towards Mr. Mangano, but the other panelists should feel free to jump in. I'm a student director at the shelter, and one of my responsibilities is running the work contract program. And although I really do admire the vision and the ambition of the national housing policies, particularly Housing First, in the last couple of years, I'm a little bit concerned that implicit in its philosophy and perhaps in its methods as well is a disturbing assumption that all of those who experience homelessness have the same needs, have the same basic identities, have the same or similar needs for community. And if my experience at the shelters taught me anything, there is no typical homeless person. Everyone's experience with the condition of homelessness is very distinct, and they have very different conceptions of what they need for their community and to transition into something more stable and a better standard of living.
Can we have a question?
Right, and so I guess my question is, like, what exactly in Housing First allows it to negotiate and recognize these differences in experience of homelessness, other than while still trying to provide for the necessities of people in this condition?
I think what we've learned over the last 10 years since we rediscovered that the central antidote to homelessness, shockingly, is a place to live. That's the central antidote for every homeless person, no matter what the cause of their homelessness, no matter what their symptoms might be. I was just in New Orleans earlier this week visiting homeless people who are currently living under a bridge. There were about 150 people. I talked to many of them over the course of hours. Many of them had been dislocated as a result of Katrina and never had found their way back into housing. Well, what the central antidote for them, when you ask the consumer, the customer, that's who homeless people are, in terms of all of our planning, all of our programs, all of our resources, it's ultimately the homeless person who's our customer and consumer. We need to be asking them what they want consistently, whether we're under Interstate 10 in New Orleans or on the streets of Washington or at the Boomtown Cafe in Seattle. Homeless people ask for one thing. They never ask for a pill, a program, or a protocol. They ask for a place to live. That's the central antidote. And in the rapid rehousing model, the Housing First model, the notion is that we don't need to be idealistic or romanticize homeless people. A lot of them have needs, just as a lot of us who are homeless at home have needs. And we need to provide the support services. Those support services need to be customized to what the consumer needs. So whatever the difficulty is in the consumer's life, you're customizing the services that support that person. When we do that, the retention rate, again, is 85%. So I think we just have to remember what the central antidote is, and we need to be dedicated to ending people's homelessness rather than managing it over a long period of time.
My name is Julie Wormser. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School for the year, and as I'm sure you've already noticed, one of our neighbors is living in front of the Harvard Coop in about 20 square feet of sidewalk. And it's become so normal that when the sidewalk was widened, her stuff was carefully placed inside the fence of the construction site. And can you help me understand how that becomes normal and why somebody who is so visibly living there has not found a place to stay that's a better place?
Well,
Alice.
I'll just try to take a shot at that. And by the way, I have had calls from residents here talking about homeless people living in the Kennedy Park. And I talked with Adam, who came to talk to me from the shelter about that recently. I mean, part of it is that We don't always have the proper outreach services to get to people, but we do have some. And there are people who it is just very difficult to reach. And you need to be very, very skilled to be able to deal with that. I mentioned the On the Rise shelter, where their skill essentially is that they have people who, go to the railroad tracks or go under the bridges and try to work with people to be able to get them to respond to this. And so that's the only answer that I have. I believe it to be true, although I could be proven wrong, that people have tried to reach out to that person or to other people whom we know about, and that they have not been successful.
Hi, my name is Teresa Hooper, and I'm a visitor to the campus and to the community. And first I want to say thank you all for speaking so articulately and being a voice for those who couldn't be here tonight. And this is close to my heart because my brother and I for several years dealt with the heartache of our mother being homeless and the worry of not knowing if she had shelter for the night or if she was safe. Excuse me, it's still very tender. I'm really thankful that she's now in a home and has a roof over her head for 2 years. It's amazing. I'm just so thrilled. But I'd like to ask you about her issue. What is done? What can be done for those who have mental and emotional issues? What way is there? Because she has her right to say, I don't want help with this.
I'll take a shot at least a couple of thoughts on that. Somewhere between, at least the estimates I've read, that about 30 to 40% of folks who are homeless in Massachusetts have mental illness, and about half of those folks have dual diagnoses, have substance abuse issues or stuff that sort of makes it more complex still. One of the things separate from the actual condition of the mental illness is the ability of that person. It's always difficult to access care. In particular, the first thing you need to access care in most situations, or at least regular care, is insurance. And so one of the things that people don't have, who are homeless oftentimes don't have because they don't have the resources, is insurance. And so one of the kind of the barriers to get over is that there's a number of associated barriers. If you're somebody who is on the street or almost on the street, it's very hard to get coordinated care, and in particular, if you're mentally ill, where you need to take the meds on a regular basis, so that you don't decompensate. I always loved that word, decompensate. So you don't sort of fall apart, right? You need to have a situation which is stable. It's sort of I'm not sure, maybe it's a chicken or the egg. He's the homeless guy, or the homeless advocate guy. He's going to say housing first. I think that you can't, if you don't have the care, you're not going to be able to stay in your housing. But they work in symbiosis. If you have a stable housing situation, that helps. But you also need a healthcare system which works. In Massachusetts, because of the health reform bill we passed recently, that's actually a lot easier. In particular, in this way, because about half of the state's Medicaid programs don't allow single people, don't allow people without children, adults without children, to be eligible for Medicaid. Massachusetts does, and we've expanded that access through health reform. So people who, and not to say that everybody in a homeless shelter, there are clearly family shelters and other situations, but those folks have a much easier time accessing care than a lot of the folks who are single, and I shouldn't say childless, but without minor children. Those folks have more of the most difficult times getting it. And yes, you have free care in Massachusetts. You can prior to health reform, but when you had free care, it was still very disjointed. It was sort of presenting yourself. You didn't have necessarily a primary care physician. With a couple of exceptions in Massachusetts hospital systems, you didn't have that kind of stuff, which is what you need if you're mentally ill. You need to have somebody who knows who you are and knows that you need to be taking your meds. And you need to have a place to help you administer those sorts of things. The kind of wraparound services to make sure that you don't decompensate. So a home is absolutely critical to that, but accessing care through a medical home is actually the term, ironically, that is used. Having a medical home is as critical to the success of folks who have mental illness and who are homeless.
I assume your mom has support services where she's living.
Remain in the home that she's been placed in. She sees a social worker once a week, and that is one of the things that I'm so thankful for, because
course.
someone is checking on her when I
Exactly.
can't.
Importantly, ensuring that she takes the medications that she has, which relieves her of some of her symptoms.
Unfortunately, she's not on medication for this problem, and that's partly because she can say, I don't want treatment.
Of course. But that's one of the roles of the social worker, of course, is to bring her
But
closer.
Yes. Yes.
We have time for one more quick question.
One of the directors. My name is Adam. I'm one of the directors at the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter, and thank you all for being here tonight. I guess I was wondering, given that the success of Housing First seems to depend upon the expansion of affordable housing units and SROs, how do you propose to, and this is a question, I guess, for all of our panelists, how do you propose to sort of motivate and incentivize communities to zone for these units that so often carry a sort of a stigma of their own within communities?
The Midtown.
Well, I'll just start it off, and I think, first of all, you have to develop political will around the notion of creating that kind of housing. And you use the term affordable housing, but in fact, what we know is that's a relativistic term. I go around the country, I see articles about affordable housing, I'm drawn to them. It's the $250,000 condominium and the development of $600,000 condominium. It will never touch the lives of homeless people. Affordable housing is essentially in a useless term in terms of the issue that we're talking about. It's housing that's affordable to people that makes sense. Affordable to people who are 0 to about 15% of median income. So even low-income housing doesn't affect this life, because low income means 50 to 80% of income. So first you have to generate the political will to actually get that kind of housing built. That's why the cost studies are so important. That if we waited for the political will to be driven by the moral and spiritual and outrage, we waited for 25 years for that to happen. It didn't happen in one place in our country that this issue was remedied through that. It's the economic argument that's now driving an unprecedented amount of political, beyond managing homelessness, to the solutions, because the cost benefits are actually in the solution. So that driving of political will to solutions, that helps to motivate the community, motivate the jurisdictional CEO, motivate the hospital, motivate the business community to put the political will and the civic will forward to actually create that kind of housing. That's been helpful in terms of overcoming some of the NIMBY issues. And in some places, NIMBY is devolved to NOPE, not on planet Earth. And then it's further devolved, you may know this, it's further devolved to banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody, banana. So overcoming that is important, and one aspect of overcoming that is to develop political will, creating 10-year plans, which there are now 325 communities around our country that have them, including Cambridge, where you bring all of the stakeholders on homelessness together to motivate them in terms of the political will, but also the civic and social will to get the job done. It's one of the most difficult problems in our country is the NIMBY issue, and we're looking for different ways, because we have a technology that can end people's homelessness. But our practice is here, knowledge here, practice here, and part of the work of those 10-year plans is to reduce the gap between our practice and the knowledge, and part of that is overcoming some of the NIMBY issues that we see.
From a housing perspective, it's important to remember when you talk about where we build housing or create housing, that there's a lot of sociological research which shows that it's a much better circumstance where the housing opportunity is integrated into the larger community. So rather than having a separate building or in a low-income neighborhood, that you have what are called mobile opportunities for housing, a voucher, for example. One of the things that calls in Massachusetts, in addition to our Section 8 program, which is a federal program, we have a state equivalent called the Mass Rental, MRVP, Mass Rental Voucher Program. And these sorts of mobile programs work a little bit different, and you can get around the NIMBY stuff, especially where you have the fair housing laws are actually enforced by the state, because you can sue the pants off somebody that says no, because it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of source of income. That's a different strategy, and it sort of gets you around the NIMBY thing, and in many ways gets you into good school systems, good economic opportunities. People can live closer to their jobs, sorts of stuff, which are also very important. Again, it's a different approach, but complementary.
Very important, and it's called scattered. It's a scattered site effort, and it makes a lot of sense. In some cities, that opportunity is available. In other cities, the only opportunity, for example, in San Francisco, where they've done some great work on this issue in the last few years, Mayor Gavin Newsom, recognizing that the Tenderloin, something needed to be done down there. He's rehabbed a lot of the old hotels there, and lots of formerly homeless people living in those hotels, because that was the opportunity. But Jarrett is absolutely right, the scattered site approach, where you deliver the services mobily and you support people in their tenancies on a scattered site basis, that's good for the health of the community and good for the health of the the formerly homeless person.
If I could just say a word about it. We've had a fair amount of experience in Cambridge over the years with this issue. And there are a couple of pieces. One is that, as has been said earlier, mobilizing the community around these issues is very, very important. And having people believe that this could be your sister or your mother, as we have heard. That this is not somebody else's issue out there, I think is very important. And we've had a lot of experience with citing various kinds of supported houses with supported serving. The other issue that comes up quite frequently, and it does in Cambridge, is the fact that when someone is trying to develop some new site of some kind of housing, is that obviously, I think you and I discussed this yesterday, obviously people try to go to the areas which are most affordable for housing. And so what if you could have a great will to have some housing on Brattle Street, but it's probably not affordable to people. And so then you have the opposite reaction, which is, why is it that these particular kinds of housing units are always being built in my neighborhood? We already have 25 in this area, and that's a big issue. The economics of it are a big issue. So to the extent, as Jarrett has said, that we can use vouchers and we can have ways of not making this so to be a new development for one kind of person, I think is very helpful.
I think one way around the NIMBY problem for me is educating people more about homelessness. Most of the time when people say they want in the neighborhoods, it's because they hear all these bad things about homeless people. Oh, they're all crazy, they're all drug addicts, they're all this, they're all that. I think that there needs to be more education around homelessness. The public needs to be taught that this is what homelessness is really all about. No, not everybody's drinking and drugging. No, not everybody's mentally ill. People work. People can function in society. So it's not like that. And I think that may be one of the ways. And the other thing that I see is that I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking to me about, we've got to convince people that this is actually going to work. You can't have, like my argument with advocates is that they got to get behind this thing. Okay, we all have to get behind this thing and to let people know this is going to work. This is a solution that is finally going to work. We've got something here. And we have to convince the general public this isn't another Band-Aid solution. This is going to work. And the only way to do that is if the advocates get together and just get out there and say, hey, this is going to work, and show that it's going to work.
I'd like to thank the panel and then make two announcements. So let me make the announcements first. First is, it sounds as though the students had a terrific and very informative pre-forum meeting discussing homelessness, eating a lot of pizza, and so we're really glad that you were there digging in and engaging on the issues, and we want to thank you for your commitment. Secondly, many of you who are in the community who have been supporting us were invited to come to the forum and also come to a reception after the forum. That reception is across the courtyard in the Taubman building on the 5th floor, and there will be people who can show you how to get there. Third, I'd like to just have everybody who is or was a shelter director as a student stand. Let me see how many. I think this is terrific, and we would like to invite you also to join us if you have time across in the forum. I would like to thank the panel. This is very much a can-do crowd who really understands both the issues and has some new visions for us for where we should go from here. So thank you very much.